Twitter bots are one of the earliest and most well-known categories. In an article written for The New Yorker last November, bot creator Rob Devin explains that Twitter bots are essentially computer programs that tweet of their own accord. While people access Twitter through its website and other clients, bots connect directly to the Twitter mainline, parsing the information in real time and posting at will. It's a code-to-code connection made possible by Twitter's wide-open API. The bots, whose DNA can be written in nearly any modern programming language, live on cloud servers which never go dark and grow cheaper by the day. Now, when we think of Twitter bots, most people are probably already familiar with the annoying spam bots that pick up on and respond to words in people's tweets with usually questionable content or sketchy links. Spam bots are easy to identify. They usually have a sexy female avatar and a bio composed of gibberish, and they follow thousands of people while nobody follows them back. There are tons of other types of bots made by artists, creators, writers, and often academics. So to give you an idea of some of the variety involved on the more creative side of the bot spectrum, I'm going to show you a few quick examples, and many of you are probably already familiar with some of these. So this first one is the Is It Art bot by game designer Patrick Rodriguez, and it's one of the more basic bots, both conceptually and technically. The Is It Art bot functions like an automated Mad Libs program. It calls from a database of nouns and inputs them into pre-written questions or sentences designed for humorous, ironic, and often serendipitous results. The next example I have is Davidson College professor Mark Sample's Whitman FML, which is a mashup of Walt Whitman quotes and tweets containing the hashtag FML. And this one is also by Sample. It inserts random rhyming words into the lyrics of the Sound of Music song, My Favorite Things. And then we have Joe Toscano's Tofu product, which acquired an incredible amount of press earlier this year. Tofu product, whose bio simply reads, Tofu absorbs flavor, wanna chat? Absorbs the linguistic flavor of its followers and spits back out a mishmash of their own forgotten words. So for example, when I've tweeted at Tofu product in the past, it's responded with a nonsensical flurry of tweets concerning everything from snowstorms, spam emails, and 3D printers, to YouTube videos, Canadian politics, and even the theorizing the web hashtag once. So it's kind of like my own personal return of the repressed Twitter history in a way. Now to segue into NetProv, which is a very different type of creative misuse from the bots I've been showing, I'm going to turn quickly to horse ebooks, which is a somewhat mysterious hybrid of both of these things. And most of you are probably familiar with this story already, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But Horse eBooks was one of the most prolific and popular bots for the 5 years that it ran, sending over 18,000 tweets and accumulating over 200,000 followers in the process. The account purportedly began as a Russian spam bot that tweeted random words and phrases from ebooks about horses. Hardly any of its tweets even made mention of horses, but the resulting sentence combinations were lauded by fans as a kind of absurdist computer-generated poetry that occasionally made a wonderful kind of sense. That is, until it was revealed to have been taken over by a BuzzFeed employee in September of 2011. So it turned out that while the internet was praising the almost human personality of something it believed to be a computer program, it turned out to be an actual human being writing in the style of a computer program. It was a human performance of artificial intelligence, and the revelation caused a huge backlash from followers who expressed very real feelings of outrage and disappointment, and even betrayal at being played in this way. The key thing to note here is that Horse eBooks wasn't just a creative misuse of Twitter, but an even further creative misuse within the genre of the bot. Shortly after the news broke, The Atlantic's Robinson Meyer published an article claiming that the overwhelmingly negative response to this turn of events should be taken as a sign of the project's artistic success. In her words, it was the most successful piece of cyber fiction of all time. But more specifically than cyber fiction or electronic literature in general, I would argue that Horse eBooks was the most successful example of NetProv that has ever been produced. According to Rob Wittig, who coined the term in his 2011 MFA thesis, NetProv is a digital art form that creates written stories that are networked, collaborative, and improvised in real time. Often compared to alternate reality games or ARGs, NetProv uses the same strategies of participatory transmedia storytelling, but differs through its notable ambivalence to game elements. Instead of puzzles, the focus of NetProv is character and narrative development. NetProv also distinguishes itself from earlier forms of eLit by its distinctive use of social media as a platform. It's experienced in real time as an interactive, collaborative performance. In many cases, a core group of writer-actors take on the roles of the main characters, each with their own backstory and explicit part to play in the narrative. Readers have the option to follow along silently, but since NetProv takes place on the social networking sites that they already frequent in their day-to-day lives, these projects openly and intuitively invite readers to play along. They can create their own characters or even participate as themselves and become part of the story, interacting with the core fictional characters and influencing the chain of events. Wittig, along with his frequent collaborator, ELIT author Mark Marino, have staged a variety of NetProv projects that all deliberately blur the boundaries between fiction and reality on social media. By creating characters and giving them life and sending them out into the wild to interact with real people, Wittig and Marino have been enacting their own brand of creative misuse on Twitter as far back as 2010. One of their more recent projects, Spidey Show, was an intentionally trashy reality TV show starring Spencer Pratt and Heidi Montag, formerly of The Hills. It aired on Thursdays at 11 p.m. in the fall of 2013, but only on Twitter. There was no actual television show. Spidey Show only existed as a synchronized weekly live-tweeted NetProv, to the great frustration of Spencer and Heidi's real-life fans. And yes, both of the stars were in on the joke and participated from their own Twitter accounts. So Spidey Show and many of Wittig and Marino's other projects have made use of their own standalone websites, but Twitter has perhaps unsurprisingly become the medium's most commonly used platform for political and satirical works. The platform already lends itself well to real-time citizen journalism. Twitter has played a significant role in various political movements, and it's become an almost immediate fount of both true and false breaking news. It makes sense, then, that politically driven NetProv would use the same channels of communication and reach out to engage with real people. Since the internet is now accessed more frequently from the devices that live in our pockets than those on our office desks, there's been a noticeable surge in real-time networked communication that situates itself in a new hybrid space between the physical and virtual. Adriana de Souza y Silva characterizes these hybrid spaces as connected, mobile, but also fundamentally social. Hybrid spaces merge the physical and the digital in a social environment created by the mobility of users connected via mobile technology devices. For de Souza y Silva, the current default state of being always on and always connected refers not only to an internet connection, but a more significant social one. It's no coincidence that social networking sites and apps have driven the uptake of smartphones. But as important as this recognition of a newly formed hybrid space might be, de Souza y Silva primarily concerns herself with how physical space is made hybrid by networked mobile media. She all but ignores the opposite effect, how virtual space is made that much more tangible by the same devices. Beth Coleman, in her 2011 book Hello Avatar, examines both sides of the physical-virtual reality divide and coins the term X-reality, which she describes as a continuum of exchanges between virtual and real spaces in a world that is no longer either virtual or real, but representative of a diversity of network combinations. X-reality isn't just a physical space overlaid with virtual data, but a fluid state of everyday existence that goes beyond the hybrid spaces described by de Souza y Silva to incorporate social, mobile, and network media at every level of experience. One of the most controversial NetProv projects, and the one most often referenced in academic circles, is Occupy MLA, which began in November of 2011 with the launch of the Occupy MLA Twitter account and affiliated hashtag. This new faction of the Occupy movement and its three leaders infiltrated the MLA convention in both 2012 and 2013, speaking out against the exploitation of non-tenure track academics and staging tongue-in-cheek events like International Hug and Adjunct Day. The movement attracted the interest of many vocal supporters and doubters, but none of the occupiers ever made themselves known in person. That is, until Marino and Wittig held a performance of Occupy MLA at an ELIT reading near the end of MLA 2013, finally disclosing its fictional status. Unlike the author's previous projects, Occupy MLA hadn't asked people to participate in the NetProv as fictional characters, but instead engaged with readers as themselves. MLA attendees and Twitter followers were led to believe they were conversing with dedicated activists and not their satirical approximations. Some suspected that the Occupy MLA movement and its most vocal proponents might be a hoax, but it wasn't until the official reveal that anyone knew for certain. Many who'd participated either by taking sides on Twitter or showing their support in person felt betrayed in the end. I would argue, however, that the movement's ultimate fictionality didn't counteract the important political statement that it made, nor the productive conversation that it fueled. Satirical fiction obviously has a long history of creating sites for critical dialogue that might otherwise be too restrictive, and as Wittig explains, netprog gives readers the opportunity to play and go deep within a shared narrative, both psychologically and sociopolitically. In their book Rules of Play, Katie Seal and Eric Zimmerman define play as free movement within a more rigid structure. This is admittedly a very broad definition, but they go on to discuss what they call transformative play, a shift that occurs when the free movement of play alters the more rigid structure in which it takes place. The play doesn't just occupy and oppose the interstices of the system, but actually transforms the space as a whole. This transformative play underlies what I see to be the true critical potential of creatively misusing social media in the ways I've discussed with you today. Creative misuse reveals alternative functions and expands the range of future possibilities for technologies that aren't nearly as deterministic as their opponents might like to believe. The creative misuse of social media illustrates the blurring distinction between our contemporary communication technologies and media of cultural representation. And it provides a venue for us to run scenarios, to speculate on premises, to play and go deeper, quoting Wittig again, using the same platforms on which we struggle through predominant social issues affecting us in our everyday lives.
So we're going to speed along so we can have more room for discussion at the end.
We'll do questions at the end?
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Knochel again. This is my colleague, Papaelias. Did you get the PDF?
It should be open already.
Get out of that.
Sorry. It's hiding directly. Yeah.
So we are both faculty members at SUNY New Falls, which to everybody who lives in the city is upstate. To everybody who's not from New York, it's like an hour and a half from here. So it's not that far. It's the Hudson Valley. And we've been involved in a number of projects, Amy and I, that are working with her expertise in interaction design and my expertise in terms of thinking about art and arts education. And we sort of meet in the middle thinking about how mobile technologies can help us to sort of bring collaborative projects with our various coursework and research. So we started on, just to clarify, the title of the talk is going to be slightly different today. So everybody who showed up today because there is ARG listed, I apologize, but we've evolved past that at this point.
You won't be offended if you leave. It's
yeah,
okay.
you can go ARG and then go out.
Yeah.
But I think what you'll find is you'll see parallels in how we conceptualized this process early on when we made our submission. But I want to share with you that this project is ongoing. We're kind of right in the middle of it, which makes it really exciting and sort of interesting, and there's lots of tensions coming up as we move the project forward. So in the last 2 years on our campus at SUNY New Paltz, and I want to make sure that everybody understands that this is, if you pay attention to the news, there is all sorts of things that come up on campuses that relate to racial divide. So ugly, stereotypical projections on campus, frat parties and things like that. On SUNY New Paltz campus, in the last 2 years in the fall, for some reason, we've had 2 incidences of a public space being sort of vandalized with a hyperbolic, sort of violent kind of language that targeted our black students on campus. And we have a long, proud tradition at SUNY New Paltz. We have one of the only Black Studies programs in the SUNY system. So there was a lot of campus sort of consternation about this event. And what grew out of that was a response by the administration to develop a talking series, a symposium series, called Let's Talk About It. Now, the it has become this sort of strange thing that nobody's really sure. We're talking about race, and that can be a good thing. It evolved into many types of its. But what we found is that over time, that process and also our understanding of the Let's Talk About It symposium and discussions associated kind of were under a form of erasure. In other words, we couldn't really find a lot of information about what the sessions were, what was happening, what was the ongoing dialogue that was happening on our campus. And we wanted to see how, being in the art department, we could connect with this dialogue and have our students connect with this dialogue. So like I said, I'm coming from art education. So I work with our core students who are going through certification and thinking about arts education and forms of pedagogy. So I'm very, very interested in how the future sort of art education utilizes innovative technologies. I'm also really interested in notions of arts-based research. So how do we use arts and investigations of materials, both digital and analog, to think about knowing the world in different ways, right? And so to take that project and impart that in terms of a pedagogical approach to the K through 12 arts education space.
And I teach in a pretty traditional graphic design program based out of the studio art program. So students are learning all of the kind of basics of, you know, print and web design, but just, you know, to kind of dig deeper and really think about social issues on campus and within the community, and how to bring graphic design into that has been really interesting. So Aaron and I found this kind of mutual space that we could bring our classes together and work on this very large, beastly group project.
Yeah, which initially we didn't tell anybody what we were doing because we just wanted to see what would come out of it.
Right.
Do you want to, next slide?
Yeah.
So the way that we formulated the project was around a couple of sort of core concepts. And so the central workflow would be that my students would begin a kind of arts-based research project that would then transfer into the design process, and then we'd have this sort of feedback and collaboration between the two courses. So I had 18 students in my class. Amy had a group of 8 students in the design course that were focusing on this particular project. So I assembled a couple of sort of core concepts. One of them would be place-based learning. So this is the idea that the curriculum that you devise and sort of the foundation upon which you build your curriculum is embedded upon your location, right? So the most deep knowledge that you can sort of harness with students and learning the most authentic exchanges that you can possibly have begins by mining the very soil, metaphorically and literally, that surrounds you, right? And so this is a learning theory or a philosophy about approaches to curriculum that can be sort of deployed anywhere. And actually I was watching a thing about hackathons the last session, Willow I think is back there actually. And so this idea of place-based learning actually occurred to me, something I'd love to follow up with. But so that's one of the ideas that we talked about in terms of the notion of designing curriculum, so this idea of place-based learning. Another component was this idea of participatory asset mapping. So this is a methodology that's based in community organizations, community organizers, where it's really an action research-based methodology. In other words, in order to understand how communities conceptualize of themselves and to offer routes for growth and sort of to find out what communities want, you go to communities themselves and have them sort of discover and understand and highlight what they would consider assets. And so we should really think about assets in a very broad term. We're not talking about sort of a real estate analysis of a neighborhood, right? We're talking about, oh, there's a park over there, or this corner tends to have people that congregate in so many, you know, for breakfast or something like that. So in terms of our campus and thinking about the sort of spatial relationships that emerge, the communities and subcultures that emerge on our campus, having students think about themselves as a community and participating in asset mapping around sort of what does this sort of culture of inclusion that we're looking to sort of tie into in terms of a conversation, what does that look like? How do we participate in that as a collective? And then finally, this notion of intersectionality. So I think the initial, the provocations, the violent provocations on campus, the threatening of students based upon racial stereotypes was couched in certain events, but our conversation quickly sort of ballooned into the complex ways that we navigate our identities, right? So the intersections between things like race, gender, sexuality, ability, all of those things became emergent qualities of how my students were understanding what it means to talk about this discussion, right? So what does a culture of inclusion try to include or recognize or honor, right? It's not just about race. It didn't stay with just looking at race on campus. It emerged into this really sort of complex notion of identity, right? That we can think about as intersectionality. So the class that I teach in particular is called Learning in Digital Visual Cultures. I've already sort of covered a little bit about this, but it's thinking about our education as sort of a public pedagogy. So in other words, this is beyond the material or creative exploration of young children and sort of finding imaginative futures, and more about being sort of engaged in the way that contemporary art practice looks at and understands the social and political world around us, right? So that's what I mean by a public pedagogy. These socio-political fields become sort of events, right? So we sort of create these events as a way of understanding, and it really becomes research, right? So how do you gain information about the way that you understand the world, but how does things like creative play, interventionist practices, ethical spectacle, how do those things, these constructed situations, allow students to gather ways of understanding the world and evolve that understanding in some way? And so that's where the digital technologies become kind of like a material to play with, right? So a lot of times folks kind of ask me like, well, you're an art education person, right? So you work with like watercolor and paint and stuff like that. Yeah, that too. Nothing against craft. I'm not going to downgrade that as being inadequate. But I will say that we look at digital technologies as being a really awesome material that we can work with to play with these complex ideas. So this is a picture from my students after their asset mapping project. We sort of formulated the central question, right? Going back to that notion of arts-based research. So we're structuring a research design. And we looked at how this notion of place-based knowledge can inspire dialogue around issues and identity on SUNY New Paltz campus. And we brought together a series of kind of points. And there was very complicated situations where they would start talking about, say, a building. And the conversation would try to evolve. Well, a building is on a map that we already have. So what are we trying to map here? What's the activity of our finding a place-based set of knowledge or learning, right? So then it becomes, well, what activities happened and what events happened in that building? What sorts of policy initiatives came out of, say, an office that was in that building? So we brought together a range of things that loosely congregated around historical events, which we defined as things that happened beyond 2 years ago. This kind of weird category, we weren't sure what to call it. Current events, but we weren't really satisfied with that, so then we started calling it present-future events, which only made it more confusing, which I kind of liked. But so those are events that were kind of like ongoing or happening this school year. So these were events that things like the conferences that were happening on campus, the catalyst event that started the Let's Talk About the Symposium itself was listed. So it's not just positive events, but the range of things that create dialogue around these issues of identity and sort of culture on our campus. The last one, and this was, again, part of our arts-based research approach, was talking about how interventionist practice. So I'm not sure how many people are familiar with this term. It's an interesting audience that we have here. If I said this at say an art conference, people are like, oh yeah, yes man, yes, we get that, right? So the basic idea of an intervention is this sort of constructing a social situation to somehow transform or provoke a different response within public space, broadly defined. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
So Aaron's students supplied the content, and they were really involved with searcing out, throughout campus, finding these different points on the map, and then the students in my interaction design class kind of culled all that information, and we created this map. And the class is really based on some of these really basic principles about interaction design, screen-based interactivity, user-centered design, and thinking about storytelling and user personas. These are undergraduates, so they're going to be entering into the field of design, and this was a really interesting way for them to approach this as opposed to just like, make an app that doesn't really work. So we use a lot of the very traditional design principles of creating mood boards and kind of trying to develop a visual identity for this. A lot of our discussion was like, is this font too playful for what we're talking about? Is this font too serious for really geeky stuff? But wireframing and prototyping. And then just this past Wednesday, we actually met with some other students on campus outside of both of our disciplines and other faculty on campus and brought them in as kind of a user feedback session. And that's become a really fruitful part for the students to really see how other people are responding to this work, and especially work that's very close to people's communities, right? These are all people that are part of the New Paltz campus. And so where we are now with the project is we have a site. We weren't feeling quite yet ready to show it to you all, but we have a site where registered users can add events, both interventionist practices, historical events, and what we're finding is that as we're discussing this and talking about this with more people on campus, people are like, oh, that event, you should add that event to this. So we're trying to start really thinking about ways of making this a really participatory, possibly like a curriculum kind of thing, right? Where how could a student in journalism become part of this? How could a class in sociology become part of adding this content and really building this into a real community resource?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's been really illuminating, especially now that we have this kind of like early prototype, is in these feedback focus groups, and we've had one, and I hope we have a couple more. Is what sort of languaging are they familiar with, first of all, and then what sort of languaging do they want to be a part of the Let's Talk About It movement on our campus, right? So what is the discourse of discussing culture? So let me give one example that I think is sort of one of the interesting ones. My students, we have this group on campus called Humans versus Zombies, where they get together once a semester, and it's a part of sort of a subculture enjoying fandom of zombies, and they get together, and some are zombies initially. There's like 2 zombies out of how many people participate, and then they have this game where they play with Nerf guns and dart guns and stuff like that, and throughout the week they eventually become all zombies, right? So my students felt like these students are ostracized because of their fan culture, therefore they should be on the map, right? And the focus group that we had was very interested in, and basically, said, well, these people aren't sort of walking around with, say for instance, racial identifiers that they cannot escape, that is not a game, that tends to walk with them everywhere they go. So how does this fit in? So you kind of get a sense of how complex, first of all, what the term culture is, what are we talking about, right? How does this promote dialogue and interaction on our campus and sort of creating a culture of inclusion is the language we're trying to sort of move towards? So I think there's lots of interest and ways of conceptualizing the languaging of the site that will continue to evolve and open up. So I think that's an exciting next phase. Yeah, so if you have any questions, there's our content, and thanks for listening. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Izul and I'm from University of Rochester. So in this presentation, I will discuss an Indonesian-made massively multiplayer online role-playing game or MMORPG called Nusantara Online. 2 emerging startup companies, Sangkuriang International and Telegraph Studio, have worked collaboratively since 2006 to develop and publish the game, which was first launched to the public in June 2011. The game uses the history of 3 major kingdoms in pre-colonial Indonesia as materials for its background narratives, and is among the first, if not the only, Indonesian MMORPG titles that promote Indonesian cultural values, so its developers claim. Here I'm interested in how the game imaginatively reconstructs the history of the Indonesian archipelago in a gamic form. Approaching the game as a historical algorithm for the Indonesian nation, I borrow the concept algorithm from Alexander Galloway and Mackenzie Ward. A dialectic process between the game's narrative and its algorithm, I argue that the game suggests a distinct model of digital nationalism that I dub playable nationalism. This model takes into account the formulation of Nusantara, an earlier term for what is now considered as Indonesian region, as an idealized yet playful version of the archipelago. In this gaming environment, the game developers attempt to create an immersive setting in which players' nationalistic experience is both open-ended and programmed. In my larger project, I explore how the game's playable nationalism is rooted in a complex process of national identity formation in the post-Suharto public debates in Indonesia. For those of you who aren't familiar with Indonesian history, in 1998, there was a massive protest that ended the authoritarian regime of the then President Suharto, and that era is known as Reformasi or Reformation. So in doing so, I identified the Sangkuriang International and Telegraph Studio game developers as representative of Indonesian digital generation who aspire to present an alternative form of everyday nationalism distinct from the official narrative. These developers are generally dissatisfied by the state's monolithic explanation of national history, which they believe makes the history unappealing to the younger generation of Indonesians who have lived most of their life in post-Suharto period. At the same time, these developers are also troubled with contemporary Indonesians' heavy consumption of foreign goods, especially in the information and technology sectors, or ICT. So even though these developers generally embrace digital technologies, they worry that the Indonesian people's excessive consumption of foreign ICT products will lead to the crystallization of a consumer mentality, thus uprooting Indonesian nationalistic values. Through the development of Nusantara Online, therefore, Sangkuriang and Telegraph game developers want to prove that video games can serve as a meaningful, playable medium for expressing Indonesian national identity. How do Sangkuriang and Telegraph attempt to realize their ambition? I will not have time to fully discuss how these developers attempt to realize their ambition here in my presentation. What I'm going to do instead is to explain briefly what I have done so far in my research and focus on one particular aspect. So in my larger project, I look at several elements in the algorithmic structure of Nusantara Online. First, I examined the idealization of the three kingdoms, which in turn functions as the idealization of Nusantara, a pre-colonial imagination of a unified Indonesia through realistic visual modeling and narrative construction. Second, I consider the development and function of Nusantara Online's game engine, that they call Angel, in terms of technological independence and nationalistic software application. And lastly, I take into account the developers' intention to create an open and collaborative environment between them and the Nusantara Online's players. By looking at these elements, I noticed that the game's algorithmic structure, at first sight, gives the impression of a collaborative nation building in digital space. Yet a closer consideration of the game exposes the limitation of the game's model of playable nationalism, which constrains players' experience with its software mechanism, represents a conventional version of national history, and offers perplexing images of racial classification. In the interest of time, I want to just focus on the last one, that is the preset templates of Nusantara Online's racial characteristics and abilities. The public version of Nusantara Online, version 0, introduces 5 types of race based on skin colors in the menu for creating a player's avatar. They are dark brown, black, yellow mongoloid, red, and white Caucasian. Players have to choose one of the options for their avatar character. Interestingly, the description of this racial type suggests the superiority of the white Caucasian race. The description of white Caucasian race reads, the best proportioned race in terms of physique and brains, always prepared for the most difficult situation, a strong and smart human known as a rational race. And so that's what is shown in the avatar's menu. So even though the players soon find out that this option of what Lisa Nakamura calls menu-driven identity does not affect the gameplay experience of the player's avatar, but only its visualization, this racial archetype becomes an anachronistic trait of the game's algorithm. Even though white skin color largely is a desirable attribute for beauty in the country, most Indonesians have never associated white skin with their authentic features. Thus, the game's logic of racial classification does not corroborate with its framing of playable nationalism. Now, how can we make sense of the unseemly racial classification found in the game? If Nusantara Online manifests a form of what Alexander Galloway called soft racism in video gaming, then this classification in the game surely does not benefit the developer's mission of promoting Indonesian national identity and its cultural values. Neither does it jibe with the logic of satisfying the game's target players, who are mostly, if not all, Indonesian nationals. Here, one way to understand this issue is to look at the interwoven relationship between the game's model of digital collaboration and its promotion of nationalistic values. From the beginning of its development, the Nusantara Online's game developers have sought players' participation by distributing the game's work-in-progress versions for free to players, willing to volunteer as beta testers and solicit their feedback. While public beta testing and user feedback are common in game development and in software development in general, the nationalistic motivation of the Nusantara Online game developers infuses a local model of cooperation of this global software practice. This model is known as gotong royong, or the principle of mutual aid and voluntarism that has been taken as a defining tradition of Indonesian society. In this commingling of global and local values, both the game developers and players built a gamic version of the Indonesian archipelago. However, the attachment of local values such as gotong royong in this participatory model of digital collaboration warns the potential for romanticizing the promises of the digital and the progressive values of nationalism. A number of scholars such as Sherry Turkle, Tiziana Terranova, and Adrian Mackenzie have addressed the exploitative potential of the seemingly egalitarian model of contemporary peer-to-peer digital collaboration. Mackenzie particularly reminds us of the fictitious universality of participatory software model because of its inability to include quote-unquote the other in software practice, noticeable in the unequal relationship between people in technically advanced regions and those in less developed contexts. In the case of Nusantara Online, then the superior characteristic of the white avatars perhaps represent a desire for equal status in digital collaboration. The quote-unquote white avatar characteristics may serve as a symbol of what L. Ayu Saraswati calls cosmopolitan whiteness, operating at once as a form of longing for the purity of the past and of belonging to the world culture simultaneously. Another way to interpret Nusantara Online's perplexing racial classification is to examine the procedural operation of the game software in constructing its playable nationalism. As Galloway argues, all elements in the game have to be put in quantitative, dynamic relationship with each other. This is the algorithmic logic of information control in gamic environment, as well as in any software application. The Nusantara Online developers must thus follow this logic when they develop the game, capturing images, transcoding the history of the Indonesian archipelago into specific mathematical models, quantifying biological profiles such as sex and skin colors, and attributing every element to the game, attributing every element of the game to specific numerical variables. It is necessary for the developers of Nusantara Online to assign this puzzling racial classification because at the algorithmic level, this classification is actually only a list of variables. In order to create a balanced gameplay, they have to allot an algorithmic value to each of the skin color. Like the simple example is like the RGB color coding when you have like 255, 255 for white and 0 for black. The transposition of a complex aspect of social life, in this case race, into an inflexible reductive algorithm has to happen. Because to create a stable gameplay, game designers require an array of variables that can be tweaked and tuned across the various environments and characters. The game developer's submission to the codified logic of its software mechanism, therefore, has forcefully regulated its form of playable nationalism. So I want to close my presentation by pointing out that video games, in the case of my project, can operate as a space for national imagining, often on the level of the everyday. In my examination of Nusantara Online game development, I'm thus interested in investigating the process of realizing this imagining, specifically how the key actors in playable nationalism incorporate the logic of computation into the formulations of Indonesian nationalism. By looking at Nusantara Online's classification of avatars on the basis of race, I want to highlight the discrepancies between what these main actors in Indonesian digital nationalism imagine they are doing and what they actually do. Ultimately, my project wants to address three central concerns. First, the promises and limitation of the digital as a liberating technology. Second, the intricate challenges faced by people in non-Western contexts participating in the network of globalization. And lastly, their ongoing struggle to consider national identity as a meaningful form of identification. With a snippet of analysis that I just presented here, I hope I have brought these concerns to light. Thank you.
So I'm Molly Sauter. I'm a PhD student at McGill University currently, and we're trying to figure out how to work the computer because none of us use PCs in our normal lives. So the project that I'm going to be presenting is a project that I'm just starting out doing. So it's, if any of you have seen me present in the past, you've seen me present a much more polished project that is now currently on its way to being a book. So this is in its much more early stages, so you'll forgive me for it being a little potentially theoretically underdeveloped. Just a show of hands before we really get going. Yay! How many people are aware of the Gay Girl in Damascus blog? Zainab's aware of it. So everyone is, okay, so I'll briefly go over it a little bit in a couple slides. So what this project is doing is I'm using Lili Chuliraki's concept of ecstatic journalistic events coupled with Ethan Zuckerman's bridge blogger figure to look at a concept that I'm calling civic fiction, which I'll explain on the next slide, to look at how figures like the Amina character from the Gay Girl in Damascus blog reflect anxieties about mediated cosmopolitanism, online journalism, and sympathy at a distance. First, what is civic fiction, this thing that I made up? I'm defining civic fiction as the construction of complex counterfactual narratives that, in and of themselves, allow people or events to participate in a civic dialogue that they would not, or that they believe they would not, be able to participate in otherwise. And it's the lie is at the key to their participation. This isn't just a politician saying, I didn't do drugs or I did not have sex with that woman. This is someone constructing a core concept that enables them to do this other thing. Very, very brief history of the Gay Girl in Damascus hoax. In 2011, there was a blog. It started in February. It was called the Gay Girl in Damascus blog. It purported to be written by a 30-something-year-old lesbian living in Syria who was born in America. She blogged about her life. She had a blog entry in April of 2011 that went viral called My Father the Hero, which was about a confrontation between her and the Syrian security services. And then it turned out that the blog was written by someone who was neither a lesbian nor Syrian nor a woman, and was in fact being written by a 40-something-year-old white guy living in Edinburgh who was from Georgia. And this was awkward. And people were upset for reasons. This is one of those things. This presentation, and in fact this theory, is not about how wildly inappropriate it is for white guys to pretend to be lesbians online. We can all acknowledge that that's probably not the coolest thing, but this paper is not about that. So we're just going to set that whole mess aside. Build a wall in your brain. We're not dealing with that right now. So I'm using Lili Chuliraki's theory of ecstatic media. So how Chuliraki defines ecstatic media is, ecstatic events are those which push beyond the limits of the normal news cycle. They require constant updates. They require a huge flow of information. So the Arab Spring is an excellent example of an ecstatic news event. I don't know if you guys remember, like sitting in front of your computer watching the live stream of Egypt, even though it was just this very tall view of lots of people you couldn't really see, but you were constantly hooked into this news cycle of information happening and happening and happening. She also defines the convergent journalism. Convergent journalism is what we view as sort of modern online journalism that picks from lots of non-journalistic sources. We have tweets, we have blogs, we have non-journalist commenting, and all of these get folded into the news cycle. And finally, she identifies the specific type of journalism that protest-oriented stories attract. So protest-oriented stories, she argues, are a specific aspect of convergent ecstatic journalism that makes particular claims on a sense of cosmopolitan solidarity, especially in Western audiences with distant subjects involved in struggles for democracy. Protest coverage specifically amplifies Western democratically aligned political voices, rendering their and our protests in a common terrain of activism against authoritative structures that limit democracy. And that's a quote from one of her papers. Essentially, she's arguing that ecstatic news coverage of the convergent type that typified the Arab Spring and that of the Syrian resistance around 2011 includes It receives by its nature and is structured to encourage the development of cosmopolitan solidarity between its Western audience and those Middle Eastern subjects by casting their voices and their struggle in familiar terms and narratives of the Western struggle and support for democracy. Will this work? Yes. So, and I'm bringing into dialogue with Chuliaraki's concept, Ethan Zuckerman's bridge blogger concept. So Ethan Zuckerman, who most of you know, started Global Voices, which is an international blogging platform that seeks to bring international news and individuals in dialogue with each other by facilitating multilingual blogging. And Zuckerman talks about the bridge blogger in his book Rewire as being this specific type of figure who can occupy more than one space at once because they were born in one culture or raised in another, etc. So we talk about Chuliaraki's ecstatic journalistic events as having an I have a voice witnessing and then being mediated through news media. And Zuckerman identifies that bridge blogger as serving a very particular journalistic role to bring those events into a cosmopolitan dialogue with the audience. So if Amina had been a real person, we're going to bracket that if for a second. If she had been a real person, she would have been an ideal bridge figure. She was middle-aged, she was born in America, she was of Syrian and American parentage. The picture presented was very conventionally attractive, which is something I'll get into later. So though her blog describes her as an ultimate outsider, her status as a binational lesbian with a lefty political bent living in a repressive state meant that she was incredibly sympathetic to informed, net-savvy, and politically active Westerners who were following the Arab Spring news cycle very closely. The blog was written in an engaging style, which the Washington Post described as emotionally resonant and really a lovely blog. I know. Her most popular entries, like My Father the Hero, were told dramatically, casting Amina and her supportive family as heroic figures in the Syrian struggle against oppression and the dictatorship. Essentially, she was presented as a sympathetic, compelling, brave, and on the pro-democratic side of the Syrian revolution. However, that if is impossible to get around. Amina was not a real person. She was a character created by someone who shared few traits of personal circumstance or history with his creation. There is a curious circularity present in Amina's creation and mediation. She was created by a member of that audience to which she was then represented as a sympathetic distant subject. Though she effectively performed the role of a bridge figure and was a compelling part of the ecstatic news cycle of the Syrian uprising, she could not actually be a bridge figure. Rather than serving as a conduit for genuine cosmopolitan sympathy, Amina could only reflect those communitarian sympathetic intuitions and preconceptions already present within the media portrayal of Syria and reabsorbed by its target audience. She was not a bridge, she was a mirror. And here I would like to posit that the mirror figure is a particular manifestation of civic fiction. The mirror figure emerges from within its own target audience and is thus extremely well positioned to fulfill the intellectual, emotional, and political needs of that audience in order to facilitate that audience's extension of sympathy to a distant or othered figure. As mentioned, as I sort of mentioned earlier, you need to be a special type of person to be a bridge figure. Not just anyone can be a bridge figure between cultures. Similarly, not just any bridge figure can be an effective media figure. Certain tropes of narrative, character, and theme are more effectively attract and hold attention, or are expected to. Everyone knows about the missing white woman syndrome, where you have this particular crime that happens where attractive blonde women go missing and everyone pays attention, but if other people go missing, no one really notices. So that's an example of a news trope that predictably gathers attention. I would like to suggest that in the case of bridge figures who are actually mirror figures, that is, fake bridge figures who are actually constructed by a member of their target audience, it is not necessary that the creator be particularly media savvy or a really talented writer. Tom McMasters, who created the Amina figure, perhaps naively, simply reproduced those tropes that appealed to the audience demographic he was already a part of. Journalists are trained to recognize what is newsworthy, and in reproducing it, they pass that training on to their audience. When McMasters took it upon himself to participate in the ecstatic media convergence of the Syrian uprising, that figure he created and the stories he told mimicked what news media was already primed to highlight and show. In addition to fitting politically and socially with a certain influential audience demographic, Amina also fit within a tradition of beautiful women imperiled in the midst of revolution. Amina came into this role after her abduction. This was how McMasters wanted to end the blog. He had her get abducted by Syrian security forces, which made everyone really upset, and then everyone tried to find her, and then they realized she wasn't there. I should have mentioned that earlier. So she came into the fore of media coverage after her abduction, primarily, the point at which she attracted the most media attention. Here, her meaning shifted. She was no longer a stand-in for LGBT populations in Damascus, but was now also a photogenic representation of the savagery of a dictatorial government, which had already been cast in the villain's role. Molly Crabapple has noted that political uprisings of the last half-decade have been particularly marked by remediated maulings of beautiful women. The most well-known of these is Nida, the 26-year-old Iranian woman who was shot by Iranian state forces during the protests following the 2009 elections. The YouTube video of her death has been viewed over 1.5 million times. Crabapple writes, Nida was a bridge character for Western media, which was never good at understanding mass movements, but always loves a photogenic face. We're also familiar with the blue bra girl from Tahrir Square in Egypt and the woman in the red dress from Taksim Square in Turkey, who's getting hit in the face with a truly astonishing amount of pepper spray. And if we go to coverage of Occupy, we also have many images of photogenic women getting assaulted by cops, either with fists or pepper spray. You can Google that if you want. This list of martyr pinups of attractive, those Crabapple's words, not mine, so I give credit to her, it's a great phrase. These women are remembered mainly because of how their bodies recorded the brutality of the state. McMaster's stage managing of Amina's exit perhaps inadvertently positioned her to join these women and thus made her story a more compelling media event within the ecstatic protest form. I love this cat. So it was impossible for Amina to truly perform the function of a bridge figure. Her roundabout, reflective nature could reflect assumptions and tropes back at the media and their audience, but in exchange of knowledge, understanding, and sympathy, so true cosmopolitan sympathy could not be achieved. A troubling conclusion from the Amina incident is that this reflection seems to have been, scroll down, this reflection seems to have been enough. No one questioned Amina's existence before her disappearance, and it wasn't a flaw in the performance that led various bloggers, including Andy Carvin, Liz Henry, and others, to question her existence after. The reflection seems to have satisfied the needs of its audience, and perhaps it is that realization which, in the end, induces a sense of crisis of sympathy within that audience. The crisis of sympathy that I refer to is a sense that those structures and organizations which Western audiences have come to rely on to direct our attention and cosmopolitan sympathies outwards, namely the internet and international news organizations, have failed or were never capable of serving that purpose to begin with. While the internet and various news organizations did ultimately reveal the Amina hoax, they didn't replace the mirror with a bridge. In fact, the loss was compounded by the realization that Paula Brooks, a lesbian blogger who had published Amina's writings, was also a straight white man impersonating a lesbian on the internet. It was a terrible day. What is perhaps most uncomfortable about civic fiction, and the Amina case study in particular, is that while the hoax remained undiscovered, it did political work. If we accept that a significant part of the ecstatic protest reporting is the effort to manifest parallel movements and inspire physical action, as truly Iraqi claims, then the remediation of Amina's words, despite their faux nature, gives her the power of a real political actor. Though Amina is not real, though she was the Orientalist performance of a white Western man, the performance nonetheless did political work. Moreover, the power to do that work was bestowed by journalistic gatekeeping structures that were trusted to protect their audience just from this type of hoax. So not only did these structures not protect their audience, but they also empowered the fraud, placing it at the dramatic center of a political struggle. Can the work that the Amina performance did be extricated from the larger story, from the work of other real individuals? Can the sympathy that the audience extended to Amina be taken back without impacting the sympathy that the audience extends to others like Amina purported to be? It is possible that the impact of these acts of civic fiction is to implicate their audience too closely in their performance, thus making it impossible for the audience to successfully extricate themselves. It may be possible that the acts of civic fiction like Amina transform the audience from audience to collaborators. And I'm done.
Great, we totally are sticking to time, so we're going to have room for questions. But I want to start right away into this whole question of is it real, which sort of goes through so many. So I work in radio, a medium that used to have fun experimenting with fake stories. But I don't think Orson Welles ever had political or civic-minded ideas when he had the Martian invasion. But as a narrative device, is that getting the audience focused around that question, is it real, can be very powerful. And it seems interesting that so many of the stories we heard from a bunch of the panelists here sort of focus on pushing it beyond just narrative power, but sort of more civic political aims. I was thinking of the Occupy MLA story. And if you want to start with that, Lauren, tell us maybe a little bit more about it. Just when I was following that story, it seemed the question of is it real was always the where the media attention kind of came from. It wasn't really trying to get people to hug an adjunct or perhaps maybe even at the site of the MLA force some of these conversations on, or was I wrong?
Well, I think the main controversy about Occupy MLA was that it was satirical, and Marino and Wittig were both contingent faculty members, so they were not satirizing or trying to poke fun of people in non-tenure track positions. But I think the problem that became such a big controversy was that people were really starting to support this cause, but people were also kind of laughing on Twitter at these three characters that were sort of running the show, and they were just kind of disorganized and not really figuring it. So people would be reading it and kind of feeling sorry for these people that were supposedly organizing this Occupy MLA thing and just doing a really bad job at it. So they were, and the words that Marino and Wittig actually used was cartoonish. So they were trying to make like cartoonish approximations of what they themselves were doing, but people were really taken in by this. And a professor I worked with at the University of Waterloo was also really taken in by this. And I remember chatting with her about this afterwards, is that there was this sort of feeling that they had been misled in various ways, and that they were starting this conversation at the MLA convention, which is a hugely stuffy conference that some of you have probably been to, and to have this conversation about contingent faculty members and the people that don't usually have a voice, and then to find out that it was fiction, it kind of took away from the power of the conversation that it fueled. And from speaking with other people about this who were there, it did lead to a more productive conversation. There have been panels the past couple of years about these issues, but there was this real sense that people were supporting something that turned out to be kind of a hoax, and that pissed a lot of people off.
Could you say, sort of going with Molly's language, that this story did like political work?
I think it did in the end. Like I said, like these were conversations that weren't really happening in these venues, and then they started happening, but they might have gone about it the wrong way. And I think it was still quite powerful in what it accomplished, but people were really feeling hurt and betrayed by it in the end.
I mean, Molly, I love that idea of trying to trace out where political work gets done with some of these civic fictions. But it seems that, leaving aside his motivations, Tom's, for creating this, I mean, he was a very good storyteller. I mean, he really did an amazing job at getting that story front and center and getting people obsessed with it. But it seems, well, maybe, because it seems at the moment in the story where the attention really focused on it, I always thought it wasn't so much that she got abducted, but it was more that Andy had put the question out there, wait a minute, is this person real? Like that, to me, seemed to be the breaking point, and maybe I'm wrong there.
So the first major news coverage of Amina was a Guardian profile that was And then shortly after the Guardian profile, there was this CNN interview that she did over email about, it was called like, "Are gay people the sacrificial lambs of the Arab Spring?" or something terrible like that. And actually that came out the day after, showing how plugged in CNN is, it came out the day after he admitted that it was a hoax. So it was obviously been in the pipeline for a while. And between then, it was very fast, but there were a bunch of articles that were like, lesbian activist in Syria missing. And it was this missing thing that people, so basically Andy came out and said, "I need someone who's seen this person." And Andy Carbon, if people don't know, it was a journalist at NPR at the time, was very plugged into the Arab Spring, and was a major source of people, like a curatorial source of people's news. And so when he started talking about it, other news organizations started talking about it. And it became one of these sort of journalistic Ouroboroses where journalists start talking about a journalistic source. And then more journalists talk about it because it's being tagged as important. And then there was this gradual decline, as Andy wasn't so much the first person to say, "I don't think this person is real." He said, "I think it's really weird that no one's met her in person, really, but she still could be real." And then Liz Henry came out and said something along the lines of, "I would find it painful to have my existence doubted, and I'm finding it painful to doubt Amina's existence, but if she's real, we should still support her." And the sort of clincher came when the State Department sort of came out and said, "We can't find her, we don't think she's real." Because the State Department got involved because she was theoretically an American national, kidnapped by security forces, and that was bad. So there was attention to her being missing, and it all built on these previous, specifically the Guardian profile, which had cast her as the face of LGBT activism in the Syrian uprising.
Yeah, no, it just seems that, again, coming back to the radio, I always thought that was the only medium where you could sort of get away with everyone listening to it assumes everything is real. But it just continues to astound me that the internet is, like, people say, "Oh, I saw it on the internet, it must be real." And you can have so much fun, which I think so many of the net prov stories and so many of the fictions that we're talking about. But I kind of want to come back to Aaron and Amy, your project, where it ended talking about with the zombie story, which seemed to me almost where it intersects with some of the work the other panelists are talking about. Sort of maybe quickly coming back to that, sort of allowing your students to sort of push the limits of sort of define, who and what racial identities or identities of groups on campus sort of fit.
I think I'm just going to jump in. So one of the things that this idea of civic fiction, in a way, I'm asking myself, because I'm asking my students to create civic fictions on a much smaller scale. The interventionist component, which is hard to describe to people. Essentially, I gave them create interventions, create 10 of them, 8 of which need to be legal, right? So they can entertain illegality and things like that. And then I also charge them with what most artists do when they're thinking about these occasions. They create, Photoshop images which composite what it might look like, so they could really think fantastically about the possibilities. So in some of the posts, they posted some of these images, and they're quite convincing. So then there's this weird space of, as users interact with the map, did this event happen, or is this an instruction for events that you can then do yourself? So there's a weird sort of little liminal space there, I think, that is attendant to this idea of a civic fiction.
Yeah, and do we purport it as a civic fiction, or do we provide a blueprint to encourage people to engage in some of these?
To replicate, yeah.
80%.
I just want to quickly turn to Aakash real quick, who's been the hashtag moderator. Anything coming from?
Yeah, we have a few.
Let's read it in the microphone, Aakash.
Right for the tech, man. You're awesome.
Is this on?
It's on.
Oh, okay. There's one for Lauren. There's actually a couple for Lauren. So the first one was, to what extent is creative play on these social platforms discouraged as detrimental to their business models and missions? I'm assuming they're talking mostly about Twitter. Also, a bear bot responded before any of us could, saying, or asking rather, do bears like me break social media because we are non-human? Are humans protective of their web? I am a bear.
go with the other one. It was mostly, I think, if I got it, it was talking about the limits and what was discouraged sort of by the platforms themselves.
Right, in terms of
Disruptive.
the disruptive.
In terms of these quote unquote bot accounts coming in, not being real users, not creating like meaningful content.
Oh, I see.
Meaningful content.
Right. So I think one of the critiques of something like NetCrowd is it tends to be something that happens in the moment. So a lot of these things, they happen once, and there's still an archive that exists on Twitter, but unless you're sort of part of that conversation in the moment, you have to have access to the technology, you have to understand what's going on, you have to be pretty much in on it if you're recognizing that it's fiction, either that or you're sort of a bystander that gets caught in the crossfire. So a lot of the problem with trying to make this work on Twitter is that it does happen in the moment, and these tend to be fairly short things. I mean, the Twitter bots are a different type of creative disease, and I don't think that's really what the question is about. But in terms of NetCrowd, it tends to be a problem with platforms that you can't really archive these conversations once they're done. And I had an interesting conversation with Rob Wittig actually about how do you archive these things. I was part of an alternate reality game that I will not talk about today, but it got shut down for various reasons before it actually happened. So we had to figure out ways to archive the NetCrowd, which was all that sort of remained of it, and it was political in ways that got shut down. But so we had the Twitter conversation, we had the website. There was no way to really make this have any sort of impact beyond what we were sort of building up. So it is something that happens in the moment, and it's really hard to sort of continue that conversation and to archive it in ways that people can actually go back to and continue to have an impact.
You know, I know we really want to stick to time, so I kind of want to let everyone sort of tackle this idea of limits, because I think that's really what, I've been thinking about the Mayan YPD thing all week, which is such an amazing story of like this hijack, and you've got this aggregation of, police abuse photos, but yet I had this recording of Bill Bratton, the police commissioner, and he spoke about it the day after. I actually have this in that latest episode of my show, and he's like mocking social media. Like you can hear it in his voice. Like he gets social media, and he totally realizes that it's impotent. And I just kind of feel that like when we think of like NetProv or some of these civic fictions sort of using this space to perhaps critique power or like use satire for political ends, like are we starting to see the limitations? Or even in a game, talking about national identity in a country where that topic is so central to moving forward. Like, do you feel that each of you could maybe speak about the limitations that we feel we're starting to look at? Start with you, Molly. Yeah.
I find it really interesting because, on the one hand, I'm an internet academic. I have a heart necklace that says internet. I'm wearing it right now. It's shiny, it's great. Obviously, I'm highly invested in the reality of the internet and the reality of things that happen there and the importance and the impact that they have. On the other hand, there is such a way, especially with the research that I'm doing now, but also the research that I've done in the past, where online activism and online sort of content making and the world that happens around it is very limiting. It creates its own walls of accessibility and of impact. And I am trying now to be newly cautious of artificially sort of restricting the sort of geography of my research to like, I just studied the internet. It's like, well, I think that we need to take the theories that we're building on the internet as sort of the reverse of what's been happening in many disciplines where we're saying, we have theories that explain stuff, let's apply them to the internet. Now we have new theories about the internet, let's take the theories from the internet and explain other stuff with them. It's like the ways in which the internet is facilitating new modes of interpersonal interaction and communication. People are then taking those modes and using them in meat space. I hate that phrase, but they're using them offline, and so that's sort of where I would take that question.
Isu?
Yeah, I'm also interested in like exploring these limitations actually. Limitation both the limitation of the digital platform itself and the limitation of the concept of nationalism like spreading in Indonesia. So, and the way I see these developers, I actually interviewed them for quite a while. So I've been following the development of this game, and I could see like how they are kind of struggling with this like how do they want to, how do you present an alternative version of national value or national cultures? Like it's different from what the authoritarian regime is promoting, but using this new platform, which is like, exciting at first, but then when you kind of converge this like the affordances of the technology itself and the idea that you want to convey, then you see the breakdown of this like potential, and it becomes like limiting. And in my case of the race stuff, it becomes limiting.
So I guess with you two, you're sort of building a case study almost to test this out.
Yeah, we'll find out.
Right. Well,
I want to say something totally different how related to our project, though, because I mean, I think we're well beyond the early utopian kind of HTML days in 1995, and we're all going to have a place on the internet and democracy and all these things. And there's been a lot of really great research about civic participation in the web. But I think the real hard truth is right in front of our face in terms of the cascading effects of denigrated net neutrality, right? So I mean, that we can't escape these sort of virtual activisms and democracies and places of voice that are embedded within sort of systems of capital. So that is an impossible tension that will never go away, and I think we're about to get really fucked coming here pretty soon.
But the discussion about it will be a trending topic.
That's a big problem, I think. The most eminent problem, I think.
So Lauren, do you want to? Well, you kind of addressed the question. I guess. We already ran over time, so I think we should give everyone a big round of applause.